Julie Giroux has a really wonderful blog, and she has these diagrams that describe a junior designer's process, and you can see it's long and winding, and there's a lot of rabbit holes. And a senior designer, where they're going from start to finish, it's very systematic. They explore certain branches, they realize it doesn't work, and they move on to the next thing, right? And what I think actually is that PM actually has the capacity to help identify these branches of explorations and define potential high-level approaches to solving a problem and identify these trade-offs really early. So those X's you're seeing close out different branches, it's something that PMs can help with because you can look at kind of synthesize the range of possibilities, the option space, and help cut off branches of exploration really early.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful Thursday evening. We're excited to kick off another event for Toronto Product Mastery Series with Yuki Yamashita, the VP of Product at Figma. Yuki will be talking about a really important topic. He'll be speaking about a PM's guide to working with designers. The format of the talk today will be a 30-minute talk followed by Q&A. So as you guys have questions, please ask them in the chat and we'll come back around to answer those questions at the end. After we wrap up in around 50 minutes, you'll have the opportunity to network with your peers. And I highly encourage all of you guys to do this. Meet a fellow product manager, product designer, product leader during the networking session because it's really fun. With that, Yuki, I'll have you kick it off.
Cool. Well, first off, thanks so much for having me and also for everyone who's tuning in. It's exciting to be chatting with everyone who's, I think, tuning in from around the world. So again, thank you. Excited to field any questions and you might have at the end, and I'll also be hanging out in the networking area as well. So excited to see some of you in person then. So as Mo mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about how to work with designers from a PM's perspective and hopefully give you some practical tips if you're a PM. And this might be interesting if you're a designer as well. So I want to first start by talking a little bit about why I'm even giving this talk and my specific journey in PM and design. And my first product that I worked on out of college is actually this one, and it's actually Hotmail. I don't know if anyone in the audience ever had a Hotmail account, and certainly you might be wondering, why on earth is this person giving this talk if they worked on Hotmail? But in any case, the first particular feature that I worked on was actually one that we internally called bubbles, and it was referred to these tooltips, right? And these tooltips pointed out new features. It showed users kind of who weren't familiar with different features, what they could be using, and it kind of looked something like this. And at the time, the team that was tasked to work on this looked like this. There was Eric, the engineer, myself, and Josh, who was a tester. And so you'll notice a notable omission, which is that there wasn't a designer, and our team was just not important enough to have a dedicated designer at the time. This feature wasn't that important. So the task of designing this actually fell on me. And I was really excited, actually. This is the first time I did something of this nature in a professional context. And I got excited to figure out some really important details, like what does the beak of the tooltip look like? What is the shape of that triangle? Where should it be positioned, the bottom or the side? How should it be styled? Rounded corners are becoming kind of a thing. Should it have more of a dark mode vibe to draw a contrast? A really important one, how do you actually close it out? Is it an X? Do you tap outside? Do you have an explicit close button? And so, these are all the permutations that I looked at, and, all these different attributes, if you multiply them together, there are probably 81 different permutations I explored. And, this being the first thing I did out of college, that was kind of what design looked like for me in my first job. After that, I moved on to slightly bigger things, and I had the opportunity to move down from Seattle to the Bay Area to work at YouTube. And at YouTube, I was the PM for the YouTube app on iOS. And the YouTube app on iOS is, it's used by a lot of different people. And the interesting thing at the time for the company was we were working on trying to make subscriptions work, that we were trying to make gain revenue not just from ads, but also from music subscriptions. And so as part of this, we were working on some important UX problems like, how do we actually make music work within the YouTube app? And it sounds super easy, but actually, it involves things like figuring out how to actually take video offline, because with music, you want to be able to listen to it even if you don't have internet connectivity. Or a really hard one was, making it so that you could actually listen to music or music videos in the background. And this sounds super simple, but actually, if this was just a cat video and you had 15 seconds left and you swipe home to go to your home screen, you don't want that video to continue playing. But if it's a music video, you do. So we had to figure out things like, do we decide what kind of videos we want to continue playing in the background? Do we give you a setting? Do we categorize videos and show it to you? So, as you might imagine, there are a lot of designers working on the YouTube app. And this was the first time I think I had the opportunity to work with a talented group of designers on a consumer-facing product. Following that, I moved to Uber. And at Uber, I was working on this app, which was the rider app. So the app for riders like you and me. And, this is actually a real screenshot of what it looked like when I arrived. And this is, I think, was when the pin was set to Chicago or something. And you can see kind of at the bottom here, the ridiculous number of products that are represented here, from Uber Pool all the way to Uber Elves, which was some kind of promo during the Christmas season. And you can see that, this product wasn't scaling. And one of the tasks that I was tasked with, along with a bunch of designers and a team of engineers, was to figure out how to redesign this app. So here I had the opportunity to work with a bunch of world-class designers to figure out, how to redesign the app, make it easy to compare different products. This was when we were starting to ask you where you're going, so that we could then show you products based on their price and time and allow you to choose that way. So that was a big redesign I worked on. And throughout my career in Uber, I had the opportunity to continue working with a lot of amazing designers. And at some point, I decided that I just wanted to try design. So at the tail end of my career there, I had the opportunity to manage a few design teams. I joined a new division at the time called New Mobility, which was focused on bikes and scooters, and got to lead the design teams there, working on the experiences. So that was kind of my first foray into the design side of the house. And then most recently, about a year ago, I joined a company called Figma. And at Figma, we really believe that design should be accessible to everyone, and we want to open up the design process. And what we've built is a tool where people can be inside the design file at once. You just send around a URL, everyone can be collaborating in real time. And here, what's interesting was obviously working again with a bunch of really talented designers, but also working with designers as customers. So it's getting a really different look. And also thinking about the design as a discipline and how it will evolve. So to kind of summarize my career, I started at Microsoft as a PM without any designers. At YouTube, had the opportunity to work closely with a bunch of amazing designers. At Uber, start to manage some design teams and understand that perspective. And now I work on a product for designers, as well as their collaborators. So a lot of this journey has been figuring out this boundary between product and design, and that's why I feel particularly passionately about the topic today. So I want to talk about that topic today, and I want to motivate it through kind of talking about the problem. So I think a lot of people were interested in this because there's kind of this inherent tension between design and PM. And I'm going to describe it through this fictional account. This is Jenny, a designer at Figma, and she gave me permission to use her profile picture in this way. But I'm hoping that you'll see this kind of transaction of conversations, and something about this will feel really familiar to you. So often when there's a designer and PM is working together, a designer might ping the PM and say, "Look, here's the new designs. What do you think?" Right? And as a PM, you're always going to be giving feedback. So you say, "Hey, can you change it a little bit in this way?" Designer goes and makes some changes, and they come back and they're like this, and you're still the PM, so you still have something more to say and some feedback to give. But there comes a point where it just feels like, from the designer's perspective, you're giving too much feedback, and they stop listening to you. They've heard your feedback, but maybe they're not acting on it. And then you commit this cardinal sin where you say, okay, you know what? No problem. I can mock some things up myself, right? And you get a reaction like that. And so here on out starts this journey of what I call PM art or PM design, where a PM actually takes on the task of designing. And there are different levels to this. So level 1 looks something like this. You might use a program like Balsamiq to draw some basic wireframes. And this is pretty safe. Designers think it's kind of cute that you're trying to design, but obviously these aren't real, so no big deal. Level 2, and this is something that I actually did, is design within slides. So, as a PM, you still don't have access to the source file often. So, you have these designs that are inside decks explaining how the product works. And then within them, you're kind of making some micro edits. So often I did this at Microsoft in PowerPoint, put some text boxes over certain parts to change the copy. Did that with Google Slides as well. It's my way of PM editing these designs. And, it looks kind of like fake enough where it's a mild annoyance for designers, but still, reasonable. And then the next level is really getting into the pixels. So again, here, you still don't have access often to the source files. So, you take an image like a PNG, bring it into a program, maybe like Photoshop, you start kind of like pushing some pixels literally to edit the design in the way you like. And so these are some actual things that I went through when thinking about kind of like designing and manipulating designs. And so, you create this dichotomy of like a designer's design and a PM's design. But at Figma, we really believe that, design is just design. And in fact, this is a screen capture of a recent design crit that we did, and a bunch of us, from researchers, their CEO, the engineers, myself, are in there giving feedback. Sometimes we're riffing on things. All the source files are there, so you can actually just copy paste right next to it and edit it yourself, and it's not a big problem. And our perspective at Figma is something that looks like this, where on the left-hand side, there are different disciplines, and there's a bunch of different handoffs that are happening. They're very siloed. In the present, it's a lot more close. There's overlapping things. The PM might know how to design, the designer might know how to code, the engineer might be doing some PM tasks, and that's kind of like the view of the world we see, where there's a lot more overlapping boundaries. So, this is a world that Figma is at least pushing for and recognizing, but that probably leaves the question of, well, even in this world where there's these overlapping boundaries, how does a PM and designer work really well together, right? It seems especially important, when you have these overlapping boundaries. So that's what my talk today is about. And the way I'm going to tackle it is just offer some really practical tips for PMs. And being a PM, of course, I put it into a pyramid framework, because why not? And so I'm going to talk about 3 different buckets of things. The first one is building some basic trust. That's the foundation, right? You need to have this in order to have a great relationship and do anything else. The second point, which is probably the most important part of this talk, is how to give useful feedback. Feedback is the most common way that a designer and PM is interacting, and it's really important to understand, what to be considering and how to give it well. And then lastly, once you've been able to do those things, you can kind of provide some unique value back. All right, so we're going to start with the foundations, building basic trust. So my first tip here is a really simple one, but it's just to speak their language, speak the designer's language by always taking the user's point of view. And the way to think about it is something like this. So in PM Speaks, we love to talk about KPIs and features, but it's kind of business jargon at the end of the day. And what designers want to hear about is not just KPIs, but what value that users are actually getting. Or in the case of features, not just talk about them as features, but talk about them as use cases that you're enabling or user journeys that you're making better, right? So this is really about taking this user-centric view of the world. and speaking that language. And I'll give you an example of where this comes up often, which is in experiments. And so, maybe you ran an A/B test and, the treatment group, right, the experiment outperformed the control. And so a common thing that PMs would say is the treatment group outperformed the control, so we're rolling it out. But this is highly dissatisfying for designers to hear, because what they want to understand is why this happened. Why did users behave this way? If I moved a button or changed its color or changed its copy, I want to understand what went through a user's mind to compel them to behave in a different way. And the reason it's important is not just because we want to understand that user psychology, but also because if you don't understand that, you can't actually apply that lesson again after the fact, or for a second iteration. So for example, if you change the copy and you don't understand why it worked, then next time you run a completely different experiment, you don't know if changing the copy will change it because there are a lot of other conditions that are different. So really understanding kind of what's going on in the user's mind is something that designers want to do, and something that PMs should be doing as well. So this is another example of really putting the customer first, not just settling for the result you see. The second tip is to really appreciate and defend the details instead of just talking about everything in terms of MVP. And if you really want to make a designer cry, you can say these things like, okay, we'll mark that polish as P2, P2 being kind of second order priority, or, that's not in the scope for the MVP, right? And designers really get triggered by these kinds of words because it's really easy for a PM to just kind of not care about the details. And when you really think about what a designer cares about, they care about the user, they care about the quality of the experience. And when any of those things are compromised, it's something that is really painful for them. And the thing I want to talk about is this idea of the quality of the experience, or sometimes we talk about it as polish. And the reality is, oftentimes it's really easy to equate it as the second order priority. It's so much more important, P0, P1, to actually build the features and make it work. And then if we have time, we'll do some of these things. But oftentimes it's not the case that it's this second, it's less important. So I'll give you an example. A number of weeks ago, we shipped two things within a couple of days of each other. One was a major feature update on the left-hand side, and it was an update, major feature that we were working on and a major update to it. And another one on the right-hand side was a minor improvement, and all we were doing was making the way we displayed numbers more accessible, right? We put a little red bubble around it and made it so that you can read it against a bunch of different backgrounds. So really simple things, something that traditionally would be considered polished. And one of the things that really surprised us was, when you just look at the tweets alone, the minor UI improvement received way more love. And this is something that we didn't expect, right? And it's not to say that you should just be looking at Twitter likes, obviously, to evaluate whether people like your features. But this is to say that, some users really care about these details. And what you might think of as polish is something that affects the end user. And so, not all polish is the same. It's basically the lesson of this story. I'll give you another example of how polish can be impactful. So this is a case, two screenshots from when I was working on the driver app at Uber. And we were doing a big redesign. And on the left-hand side was the old app, on the right-hand side was the new app. And one thing we really wanted to do was really make the experience of going online great. So in the past, it was a basic toggle, and by all kind of conventions, that's a really good way to have show an on-off state. But our feeling was there wasn't that excitement. It very much felt kind of dehumanized to just indicate that you're now available for taking requests. We wanted it to be like you're starting a journey and you're about to go make money, and it's something that's exciting, right? And you might look at this kind of pulsing go button and that whole experience and the extra day of work that it takes as something that's really gratuitous. But actually, there are times when these actually pay off in different ways. So in our case, we actually used this in all of our marketing, and it was actually part of the branding of the whole campaign of why we did this in the first place. So here's Dar here talking about the about the redesign in front of a huge, big go button, which became kind of a brand moment. So, this is the case of there's some small details. It's not every detail that you can choose to really elevate, and you actually get a lot of leverage out of it, even outside of the product. And the last tip about polish is, it tends to be this thing that feels like an additive thing that you have to fight for in terms of extra engineering time. But oftentimes it can be actually free. This happened to us when we were working at Uber on the Rider app. And on the left-hand side was how we used to render cars on the map. And on the right-hand side was Lyft. So we were already doing well in terms of state of the art. You have like a kind of like, more realistic cars on the left, and Lyft had a very like one-dimensional cars. But one of the designers, Peter, was a 3D animator in a prior time, and he came up with this concept of showing kind of 3D cars on the map. And he got really excited about it. It was just working on it in his own time, and he was so excited about it that he built this basic prototype. And the way it would work is as you're rotating, you would just, swap out these underlying sprites so that it would give this illusion of a 3D object. And he figured out all these different details. And he just approached an engineer. And he, Sammy, who was an iOS engineer, and just, showed it. It's like, I really want to do this. Isn't it cool? And the engineer, Sammy, just agreed, and he just thought that it was too cool not to build. And he's like, said, don't worry about it. We won't kind of count these extra days. I'll just get this done because it's really cool. And the lesson here for me was that, at the end of the day, building products is this really human process. And a lot of it has to do with these social dynamics and motivation and stuff like that. So there's no need for a PM to kind of get in the way of something like this. Some people, many people have different motivations for building something, and a designer should feel totally free to inspire an engineer to do something to go above and beyond. So that's kind of how I've approached these kinds of polish too, where I just encourage the designer to kind of pitch the engineer directly and get them excited instead of kind of always feeling like it has to go through this formal process. So that was a little bit on polish. And now on to the next tip. Which is a really simple one. I don't actually even have a slide for this other than, saying that making sure that designers are presenting their work to stakeholders. So this is a mistake that often PMs make. They're the ones setting up the meetings, and they're the ones often creating the decks, and you inadvertently end up sharing the designs because it's just easier to do so. But this is exactly the kind of thing that makes designers feel like they don't have a place at the table. And designers are really great storytellers, and so making sure that when design work is being presented, that designers are actually the ones presenting it is really important. Cool. So that was some basics. Now I want to get to the meat of this talk, which is about giving useful feedback. And the first tip I have to give here is just a really basic one: to first zoom out before zooming in. It's really tempting to just start and zoom into the details, but your job as a product manager is to zoom out first. So I'll give you an example. So this is actually a real screenshot of the Uber app that we shipped at some point. I'm not proud of this by any means, but let's just say that this is brought into a design crit or a review of some kind. So the zoomed in thing to do is to immediately kind of pick up on all these details, right? What are these green dots? I don't understand them. Or why isn't the primary CTA more prominent? The primary CTA in this case, by the way, is set pickup location in the middle, but who would have known that? There's just so many things you could be doing on the screen, right? This is all valid feedback. But where you have to start is something a little bit more zoomed out. And ask questions like, what is your goal with this design? Or what are you hoping the users will do? And in framing it this way, it helps you understand how the designer is thinking about the problem, what assumptions they might be making. And there you can figure out like what would be the most important thing to talk about rather than kind of attacking these details immediately. And you might get to these details eventually, but this is the best place to start because your job is to kind of zoom out. Whereas, a designer, for example, is necessarily kind of like zoomed in and working on these details. My next tip is when giving feedback is to first ask what kind of feedback they're looking for. So same example, it's really easy to just jump into the details again and say, hey, we don't really use this shade of green, or okay, what about this edge case where we can't fetch the data to render these green dots? Like what happens? What do we show? And a designer's just sitting there, saying, who knows? Like, I don't know. Is that really important right now? And this is a really common thing that happens. At Figma, when we do design crits, the first thing we ask is, okay, what kind of feedback are you looking for? And sometimes designers will say, look, I want you to pretend like this is the final UI. Every single thing from the copy to the pixels, I want you to react to it and to let me know what's wrong. And other times they just want some gut check. They want to gut check some ideas or get an initial reaction to a bunch of different ideas, or to go broader, right? And they haven't figured out a bunch of details. And in fact, what they want to do is just continue to explore a little bit more broadly. And the way you give feedback looks very different depending on those scenarios. So it's really important that you ask in the first place. My next tip here is probably the most important tip I have to give, which is how to handle when you see what you think is bad design. And my advice here is actually to start by actually debugging the constraints that likely led to the design rather than attacking the design immediately. So again, I'll give you an example and return to the same example. So, when you look at this, it's really easy to just start kind of attacking a bunch of things here. So for example, this button, schedule a ride, right? It's kind of different style. It's floating on the button, floating on the map, despite not really being related to the map. It feels bad because it's creating this precedent that, these actions can sit on top of a map. So who knows what other teams might want to add on it. And so there's just a bunch of things that you could start kind of critiquing it. But then if you zoom out for a second and you're thinking, okay, why might a designer have chosen to put this there? Then you start to realize some of the context, like, oh, this is the scheduled rides team. And they're under a lot of pressure right now because 2 months ago, Lyft first announced scheduled rides. So this team has to get something out really quickly. It's a small team of a couple engineers. They're new. They want to get something out. Maybe they even just want to run an experiment to understand the headroom. So they don't want to kind of natively integrate it with other things where they have to refactor everything. So, understanding all of that context doesn't necessarily make this design okay, but it helps you understand kind of where people are coming from. And then you might, as a PM, challenge some of those assumptions. That's where you can really be useful, right? And this is where you're kind of challenging some of the constraints. Or another example is this one where this is kind of the primary CTA. And you might ask, well, why isn't it kind of the standard primary CTA that every other app uses, which is a button at the very bottom of the screen that's ergonomically accessible, right? But if you play it out in your head, you're like, well, if you put a primary button down there, it pushes everything up, the map becomes smaller. And here the map is really important because you want to deal with these green dots. And so again, not necessarily the reason this is right, but it gives you a little bit more empathy. Another example here, why is enter destination another kind of optional CTA? Why wouldn't we have asked you for that in the beginning? And if you think about the context, you're like, well, maybe it's the case that you don't want to add a new step in the funnel. Or maybe people are afraid that forcing you to enter destination will kind of decrease conversion. So all these things, you can put on the shoes of the designer to think why they might have chosen these things and help debug the constraints that led to it, right? So again, if you, instead of critiquing the design, you can critique the assumptions that led to the design. And a PM should be really great at critiquing these assumptions. And it starts from a place of empathy by saying, look, actually, given these constraints, I couldn't have come up with a better design either. So this is, I admire that you actually even got here, but really the problem is actually these constraints, right? So again, it's a slight shift in positioning, but a really important one. And I've often found throughout my career that there are some common culprits to kind of constraints that, you can challenge. So for example, designers might create a design because they're optimizing for the design system or some pattern consistency. So for example, maybe the CTA isn't clear, but it's because it's not part of the design system, and maybe they don't feel equipped enough to go refactor the design system. Another common one is that they're prematurely restricting the solution space because of the scope, and they have some assumptions about the engineering cost or maybe even team ownership. Sometimes with bigger companies, you might think, oh, I can't touch this area, so I need to work around outside of it. Or maybe your engineers have already told you that it needs to be able to be done in a week, so you're limiting those options. And those might be the right things to do, but it's like a really fruitful thing to talk about. Or a common one is just that a designer might have weighed the importance of different use cases differently, right? And sometimes they might be over-indexing on one, or maybe you're under-indexing on another. But these are some common culprits for what kind of produces a design that might be, at first look, a quote-unquote bad design. And my last tip on feedback is just helping distance the author from the work. And when I was in college, I read this essay by Roland Barthes, who's a philosopher. It's called The Death of the Author. And it was talking about this idea that at the time, people, when they were evaluating and critiquing art and writing, a lot of the discourse was about authorial intent. So the purpose and meaning of the work was tied to what the author had actually intended. But Barthes' kind of assertion was that the author doesn't matter. We should be evaluating the piece on its own and how society or the audience is responding to it, right? So the piece can be evaluated independently from the author. And so this is kind of his provocative statement that the author is quote unquote dead. And this kind of, regardless of whether you believe that or not, this kind of resonated with me from the perspective of a designer or us building product, where a consumer, a customer using your product doesn't know anything about the author, and they don't really care, right? They don't exist as far as they're concerned. And when you take that attitude, it really is a little bit more liberating. And so the tip here is to make sure that you're kind of critiquing the design and not the designer, because it doesn't matter. All that matters is the actual end product. So in this particular case, right, some basics is, saying things like, on the left-hand side, your use of the different buttons makes it hard to understand the primary CTA. It just criticizes the designer instead of the work. And there's just a basic objective way to talk about it. The use of different button types in this design, right? So, this is a very basic step. But a more nuanced one is something like this, where you might give a critique like, I feel the visual hierarchy of this is hard to follow, which feels like legitimate feedback to give, but it's actually not from the eyes of the customer. It's often just your opinion as someone who builds product. And so you really should be focusing your critique on how users would experience it. And so one way, kind of trick I use, is sometimes when I see a screen that's really complicated and hard to really understand, I would say something like, if a screen reader were to describe this page to the user, what would it say? Or if you take it to user research, what would you want the user to say when they are asked what's to describe the screen? And so these are ways in which we ground the critique, not on users, rather than focusing on on our language as creators. All right, so now you've built some basic trust. You're able to give useful feedback, and it's a question of how, as a PM, you can provide unique value to the relationship between with your designer. And the first one I would say is just really making sure that you've clearly defined the right problem. A lot of times it's tempting for you as the PM to just go right into the solution and help with the solutioning, but oftentimes the problem is actually not in the solution, but in the problem statement itself. So, this is a really radically oversimplified view of the world, but at least in my eyes, the PM is always responsible for the why, and so if the PM defines the why of what we're doing, why we're doing, why it's important, then a lot of other things will follow, right? The what might come from the designer, maybe it comes from the customer, the how might come from the engineers or designers. But, if we don't get the why right, anything else subsequently won't work. And so at Figma, we create kind of these rails to ensure that we're actually kind of making sure that these things are defined well. So, we have something called the problem alignment product review, where once the problem statement has been written, we actually we evaluate that before we move on. And then we have the solution alignment review that looks at kind of the solutions. And this avoids scenarios where people are looking at solutions and then suddenly are challenging the very premise of the problem in the first place, which is something that happens all the time. And we enforce this in the way we do product requirements docs too, where there's a top section of what the problem is, what goals and success look like, and you have to define that first. So those are some tips, some process tips for kind of ensuring this habit. And then the last tip I have to give today is another way in which you can add value. And oftentimes, you as a PM can play the role of synthesizer and synthesize all the work that your designers are generating. So it's not always the case, but my most successful relationships have always been when one person was a generator and the other person was a synthesizer. It's actually hard to play both roles at once. And then depending on the personality, maybe, you as a PM might be the generator and the designer might be the synthesizer. But conceptually, I think of this as a really healthy way to have a relationship, and you can think about how you might play one of these roles for your designer. And this kind of comes into play when you're thinking about, a designer's journey. So Julie Giroux has a really wonderful blog, and she has these diagrams that describe a junior designer's process, and you can see it's long and winding, and there's a lot of rabbit holes. And a senior designer, where they're going from start to finish, it's very systematic. They explore certain branches, they realize it doesn't work, and they move on to the next thing, right? And what I think actually is that PM actually has the capacity to help identify these branches of explorations and define potential high-level approaches to solving a problem and identify these trade-offs really early. So those X's you're seeing close out different branches, it's something that PMs can help with because you can look at kind of synthesize the range of possibilities, the option space, and help cut off branches of exploration really early. So those are some ways in which sometimes as a PM you can help, because it can be really daunting for a designer to, when given kind of an infinite option space when exploring a solution. So those are the tips I had to give about building basic trust first, giving some useful feedback, and then figuring out how to provide unique value from there. And that's all I have for today. You can find this talk at figma.com/@Yuki. It's a community page. It's actually a Figma file. So if you want to go ahead and edit it, copy it, edit it, remix it, please go ahead. I'd love for you to do that. You can also find me on Twitter here. And I'm excited to take some of your questions and also hang out with you later. Thanks again for having me.
Awesome, Yuki. Thanks for that amazing talk. Those are some very rich tips throughout the whole talk. And I've collected some of the questions, and I'm going to go through them that folks asked. So one of the questions that somebody asked was, with Figma, do you have the issue of having too many cooks in the kitchen? If everyone is designing, do you ever? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that can happen, and I think a couple of things. One is I think it's really important to kind of think about, define a framework for how people can be involved. So for example, one of the nice things about Figma is that we can be transparent and that anyone can see what's going on. But that also can mean that anyone can give feedback really easily, and it can become a mess, and it's hard to understand whose decision or whose feedback matters. So oftentimes a lot of companies do this where it's really clear who's accountable, who are kind of these next round of kind of peripheral kind of stakeholders who may give you some opinions, but you don't necessarily have to act on it. So a RACI framework is one example of this. And that can help navigate this a little bit. But I think most importantly, when you create a culture of transparency, it has to be paired with a culture of respect. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And so that's the thing that I would really focus on in terms of, again, it's kind of like this talk here of how to give good feedback. There's a lot of etiquette around it. And so you don't want to be that person kind of swooping and pooping into design and, leaving comments and leaving. You should have this mentality that if one of my favorite quotes is, he has a right to criticize who has a heart to help. And it's this idea that you don't just criticize. If you want to, if you criticize, you should also be, helping in some way.
Got it. That's awesome. There was a few questions around how much do engineering constraints influence design work, and should designers should they have the ultimate ability to design whatever, and how often do these constraints guide or limit your work?
Yeah. I think of it, it's really hard actually as a designer to figure out kind of when to push back against engineering constraints and when to work within them. Part of it is like really thinking about it as like a switch that you're putting on or off. Because there's some points in a project, especially when you're thinking broader, that you need to kind of turn it off for you to be able to kind of imagine some really potential solutions. And that might actually inspire engineers to come up with, some creative workarounds. And there are other times when we really need to get this done and we're executing, and it needs to be, you need to be tied to the hip with the engineer. And I think part of it is figuring out where you are in the design process. I think that, generally speaking, I like for a designer to be pushing against these constraints a little bit because they're the advocates for the customer at the end of the day. And a customer doesn't understand these engineering constraints. And, sometimes like if a designer can advocate for that, the engineers can advocate for feasibility, and the PM can kind of like navigate that trade-off. I think that's kind of like a healthy relationship. But having kind of like the communication to really know when to turn on that kind of switch, be like, look, like we just need to get this done. I think that's the most important thing.
Got it. Awesome. One of the examples that you showed was of the Uber Go Live button.
Yeah.
And you said that the designer worked with the engineer, and then they had the autonomy to go and build that. Now, if I look at the Uber driver experience, that going live is massive. It's a pretty major experience. So our question is around so is there enough autonomy for the engineer and designer to make that decision on their own, or are there further approvals required at a company like Uber? Because I'll tell you, from companies in Toronto, there would be a lot of approvals you'd have to go through and a lot of red tape, and there wouldn't be empowered product teams, unfortunately. It just sounds like it's hard.
Yeah. I mean, it always depends on kind of the people at play and the level of trust that they've built within an organization, like all those different things. So I don't think there's necessarily a blanket answer. I think that sometimes you do have to spend the time to kind of like sell the idea first, and you might have a more approvals-based culture. I think that, the healthiest things that I've seen are when, people are given the ability to take a little bit of risk. And, as leaders, maybe you should focus instead on what rails you can put in place to mitigate kind of the downsides. And, with brand, it's pretty hard sometimes because sometimes it can be a little bit more of a flip to the switch, but I think that was kind of the mentality we took at Uber, where, you have the autonomy, but it also means that if something goes wrong, you're very, very accountable. Everyone is incentivized then to create a system that focuses on, okay, like how might we, mitigate the downsides, maybe do a beta, get some like user testing, all those kinds of things. So, no blanket answer. Totally understand that like you can't always steal those moments and individually, and there might be a little bit of consensus needed, but that's how I at least think about the optimal case.
Nice. And another question that we had earlier was around with experimentation, the tools for experimentation, the resources for experimentation becoming more widely available, companies getting used to more experimentation. Do you see a conflict, or is there a place where the designer's intuition is less valued, if I was to say, because you can just test everything? What are your thoughts there?
That's a great question. I think my view on it is a few things. One is that actually a designer's instinct is even more important because there's an infinite number of experiments that you could be running. And, you're not going to get to the best design by just brute forcing it, right? You're not going to try like a million permutations and see what sticks. Each experiment still takes some amount of effort to do, right? And at Figma, one of our growth PM, Saba, she has this phrase called winning experiments. And, this idea that, you should run an experiment assuming that it'll win, and that, you're just doing it as an experiment because, the humility of maybe being proven wrong or something like that. And I think a lot of that has to do with, a designer figuring out kind of like, the user kind of mindset at the time and what kinds of behaviors they can drive. So it's very much, I think designers should be playing a really big role in selecting which experiments are run in the first place. So that's kind of like answer number one. And then answer number two is that there are a certain class of project of things that are harder to experiment towards and use experiments to answer. So for example, when you're thinking about kind of like a larger redesign, one of the things that you have to do is figure out how to kind of like reorient the information architecture and in a way that scales towards the future. And some of those future use cases don't exist, and therefore you can't actually technically test them. And so those are cases where you have to rely a little bit more on user research or some principles or things like that, versus just kind of like hard experimental results. So, there's definitely kind of a space there as well. So I don't really think that, I think they're very complementary in that way.
Got it. Okay. We had Alexander was apparently a VC in the audience, and he asked, there's a trend for VCs to start to staff internal product design and AI folks. What are your thoughts to help their portfolio companies? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that adds value, or should a designer only be embedded to have the ultimate value to the team?
That's a good question. I think it always depends, because sometimes teams don't have the luxury of hiring dedicated people, or they don't have access to talent as easily. So from that perspective, I would never push back against this idea that there are resources that startups can leverage. So I think that's good. I think that what is important though is that part of building is being there on the ground, understanding all these different constraints, because all the subtle decisions you're making are kind of at that level where there's a random engineering constraint. You have to work around that. And, execution on that front is really what makes or breaks a product. And so it can be a little bit harder for someone to just kind of like theoretically help in one way without someone who's actually kind of like on the ground doing it. So I think, that's just the one caveat I would give. Yeah.
Awesome. Very cool. And the last question before we go into networking is around, what's the best way for designers to stay up to date with the latest trends and conversations in UI and UX besides Drivel and Behance?
Great question. That's an interesting question. I think that, at least at Figma, we pay attention to a bunch of different sources. I mean, designers are so active on Twitter. It's pretty crazy. And, obviously it's a little bit of like an echo chamber in some ways, so you have to be careful there. But you see a lot of new trends emerging there, and a lot of impassionate kind of discourse about, like, say, new morphism or something like that. And so I think that's a good place to have a sense of some of the dialogue. One of the things that we're working on at Figma is the Figma community, and this is where people can publish their work and open source their work, things like that. So we're hoping that that becomes a place and hub over time that we can kind of like speak to design trends or kind of like the active dialogues that are happening. But in some ways, I might say this is an unsolved problem. So we would invite the audience to kind of figure out how we could solve it. Yeah.
Awesome. And with that, Yuki, I will share in the Slack channel, sorry, in the channel, your Twitter handle, and people should follow Yuki, because that would be, it's a great learning on your Twitter channel as well. So with that, I would love to just kind of get you guys over to the networking piece and explain how that works. So essentially, thank you, Yuki, for your time and staying with us today and the deep insights that we learned. We had people attending from Australia, Karachi, London, Sydney, California, Vancouver, Toronto. These are only the people that I know about, but I'm sure there's many, many more folks that are here. And now you can actually get to meet them. So how networking works is that you just simply head over to the tab that says networking. And whenever you're ready to go, you hit I'm ready to go. And once you're ready to go, you will be matched up with someone else who you can speak to for 3 minutes. And if you decide, you can both connect with each other and you'll exchange details and you can keep in touch after. So with that, I'd like to thank Yuki again. And we're going to be sending out an email to get everyone's feedback. And thank you all for attending. And let's head on over to networking, and we'll see you and meet you there. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
See ya. See you in networking.